I died 11 months after the gondola came down, and I came back 3 weeks after it, not 3 weeks before. I cannot stop it. 6 people are already dead. All I have is 11 months of knowing where to look. I came back on the 14th of February, standing in the drive station at Beinn Aoidh, with a torque wrench in my hand, and the machine cold, and the whole hill shut, and the first thing I did was not scream, and it was not weep. I walked out onto the loading platform and counted the carriers on the line, and there were 41, and there should be 42, and that is how I knew where I was. Because carrier 19 went off the rope on the 22nd of January and has been in a locked container behind the workshop ever since, with a police seal on it. 3 weeks after, not before. I want to be exact about what that meant, standing on that platform in the cold, because everybody who hears this assumes the horror is the dying, and it is not. The horror is arithmetic. If you come back before, you have a job, and the job is horrible and enormous, and it is a job. You get in front of it, you stop the machine, you make a fuss, you get sacked, and 6 people go home. If you come back after, there is no job. There is nothing you can do with any of it. Anna Petrakis and her husband are dead. The Frayne boys, who were 9 and 11, are dead. A woman called Hester Lang, who was on her first holiday since her husband died, is dead. And Rab Innes, who was 24 and who was at the controls, is dead, and he is going to be blamed for it in 11 months by a sheriff in Inverness, and that is the only thing in the entire structure that I can still reach. I stood on that platform and I did the only useful thing available to a person in my position, which is that I got out a notebook and started writing down everything I knew about the next 11 months while it was still fresh, because I had learned it all once already, and I was not certain how long it would keep. I should say what the 11 months were, because everybody assumes the first life was the wasted one, and it was not, it was the education. I sat in that room for 9 days of evidence, and then read 4,000 pages of productions over a winter, at a kitchen table with a highlighter, because nobody else was going to, and because I could not sleep. I learned what a production is, and what a crown precognition is, and what the difference is between a finding and fact and a recommendation. And I learned, slowly and far too late, the single most important thing anybody in my position can know, which is that an inquiry can only look at what is in front of it. It is not an investigation. It does not go and find things. It receives what the parties give it, and the parties are the ones with lawyers, and the ones with lawyers are the operator and the contractor and the Crown has 40 other cases. Nobody in that room was hiding anything from the sheriff. Everybody gave him everything they had. It is just that by the time anybody framed the question, the answer had been in a lorry for 7 months. The inquiry took 11 months the first time. I sat through most of it. A fatal accident inquiry in Scotland is not a trial, and nobody is on trial, and that is the thing that makes it so useful to the wrong sort of person. The sheriff makes findings about what happened and what precautions might reasonably have been taken, and nobody is convicted of anything. And the findings are then quoted for 20 years by everybody who was there, as though they were a verdict of innocence. The determination in that first version, which was published on the 9th of December and which I read in a hospital waiting room, found that the carrier detached because the grip had not been correctly re-engaged after a stop cycle, that the stop cycle had been initiated manually from the drive station, and that the attendant on duty had not followed the reset procedure. The attendant on duty was Rab Innes. Rab could not give evidence because Rab was in the drive station when the emergency stop went in and the shock loading took the carrier off, and he had 31 seconds of that morning left. So the inquiry heard about him from other people, and the other people were his employer. And the finding was, in the polite language those things use, that the immediate cause was an error by a young and inexperienced operator, and that the center's training arrangements might reasonably have been improved. 90 words about the training and 11 pages about Rab. And what I knew, 11 months in, at the end of the first version, having sat in that room and read 4,000 pages of productions, is that the manual stop was correct. The manual stop is what you are trained to do. Rab put the stop in because the rope was doing something no rope should do, and the reason the rope was doing it is a splice, and the splice was not an evidence, and it was not an evidence because by the time anybody thought to ask for the splice inspection records, they had been lawfully destroyed. Rab Innes was 24. I want him in properly, because in that determination he is a mechanism, and he was a person, and he worked for me. He came to us at 19 off a modern apprenticeship that the center only ran because of a funding stream that ended the year after. He was slow at paperwork and quick at everything else. He had a tea flask with a Partick thistle sticker on it that lived on the shelf above the console, and that was, for about 4 months after, still on that shelf because nobody in that building could be the person who moved it. He asked good questions. That is the thing I would want on his headstone instead of what is on it. In the November, 2 months before, he asked me in the drive station why the splice log had a gap in it, and I told him the gap was because the splice inspections had gone over to the rope contractor's own system in 2019, and that they held the records now, and he said, so who checks they've done it? And I said the contractor certifies it annually, and he said but who checks? Nobody checked. That is the entire answer, and it took me 11 months and a death to be able to say it out loud, and a 24-year-old with bad handwriting got there in a drive station in November in about 9 seconds, and I told him it was fine. 4 things about me so you know who was standing in that drive station. I am 41, and I have been on lifts since I was 23, which was an accident. I did mechanical engineering at Strathclyde and hated all of it except the fatigue module, and took a summer job at a center in the Cairngorms and never left. I am one of about 90 people in this country who can sign a certificate for a detachable gondola. My father was a fitter at Ravenscraig and told me once, at about 15, that the difference between a good tradesman and a bad one is that the good one writes it down when nobody is watching, and I have written everything down for 18 years, and it did not save 6 people. And in 2021, I raised the splice interval with Struan Machar, verbally, in a corridor, and he said he would look at it, and I did not put it in writing, and that is the sentence I have carried through 2 lifetimes. It was a corridor. It was 90 seconds. I had 100 other things, and I let it go, and there is no version of the last 2 years in which I get to be only the person who fixed it. A haul rope splice is 11 meters long. That is the technical part, and it takes 90 seconds. A gondola runs on a continuous loop of steel rope, and a continuous loop has to be made continuous somewhere, and the place it is made continuous is the splice, where the 2 ends are unlaid and the strands tucked back into each other over a length of about 400 rope diameters, which on our rope is 11 meters. It is done by 2 men over 3 days, and it is the single most skilled thing in the whole installation. A splice is inspected at intervals, magnetically and visually, and the intervals are in the standard. And if a splice starts to move, the rope diameter changes over that length, and the grips do not sit on it the way they sit on the rest of the rope. Ours was last magnetically tested in 2018. It should have been done in 2021 and again in 2024. It was not done, and the reason it was not done is not a conspiracy. The contract moved to a new rope contractor in 2019. The scope of the annual certification was written by our operations director rather than by an engineer, and the words magnetic rope test appear in it once in a schedule against the rope and not against the splice, and nobody on either side of that contract noticed for 6 years because both sides assumed the other one had it. That is how these things actually happen, not villainy. A schedule written by a man in a hurry who did not know what he was leaving out. The villainy is what happens afterwards, and it happens in week 9. Retention purges happen on a schedule. Every organization of any size has a retention policy, and ours said that operational maintenance records outside the current certification cycle are retained for 6 years and then destroyed, and the purge runs twice a year, and it is administered by whoever holds the records, and it is signed off by a director. And in the first version of this, in the 9th week after the accident, on the 28th of March, 4 boxes went out of the portable building behind the workshop into a confidential waste lorry, lawfully, on a signed instruction, and among them were the rope contractor's handover files from 2019, which are the only place in the world where the 2018 magnetic test certificate and the 2019 scope of works sit next to each other. Struan Machar signed it. He has been operations director since 2016. He is 59. He wrote the 2019 scope, and I have gone round and round for 2 lifetimes on the question of whether he knew what he was destroying, and my honest answer, which nobody likes, is that I think he did not know on the 28th of March and did know by about the June, and that the difference between those 2 men is the whole of the ethics of this, and no court is ever going to be interested in it. So I had 6 weeks. That is what I came back with. Not a chance to save anybody. 6 weeks and a date, and the knowledge that on the 28th of March 4 boxes go, and once they go, the inquiry has nothing to look at except a dead boy's reset procedure. I tried once, and it went exactly as badly as I deserved. On the 27th of February, 3 days after I came back, I went to Ken Folis and told him the Splice needed a magnetic test before the hill reopened, which was true, which is a thing I was entitled to say as the responsible engineer, and which I said with a good deal more certainty than a person can have about a rope she has not tested. He asked me what had brought it on, and I said the wrong thing. I said, I know what the inquiry is going to find. He went very still, and he said, the inquiry hasn't started. And I heard myself from about a foot outside my own head, and I said something about the pattern of the damage and got out of that office, and for the next 4 days I was watched in a way I have never been watched before or since. Fiona rang me twice about how I was coping. My line manager asked whether I wanted to take the rest of the season off on full pay, and somebody, and I have never found out who, moved the workshop keys. I got them back by asking for them in an email, and that was the entire lesson, and it cost me 4 days out of 6 weeks. I did not tell anybody. I want to be clear about why, because it is the same reason every time, and it does not get less true. A woman who says she has already lived the next 11 months is a woman who is signed off sick by Friday, and the one thing I could not afford was to be a person with an explanation. So I did the least dramatic thing available. On the 3rd of March, I asked the office for the retention schedule, in writing as the responsible engineer, on the entirely genuine grounds that I needed to know what documentation would still exist when the investigation asked for it. Nobody refused me. Nobody has ever refused me anything I have asked for in writing in 22 years, and that is the single most useful fact I know about how organizations work. The 5 weeks before that Sunday were the strangest of either life, because there was nothing to do, and I could not be seen doing nothing. The hill was shut. There were 11 of us on site doing recovery and preservation work under police direction, and my actual job in those weeks was to be available to the Health and Safety Executive Inspector, and to say I do not know a great deal, because I genuinely did not know it yet in any form I could evidence. So I sat in a portable building with a man called Gray Ferrier from the HSE, who was thorough and decent, and who I liked enormously, and I answered his questions accurately and unhelpfully, and every single day I did not say the words magnetic rope test to him, because the moment I said them he would have asked for the records, and the moment he asked for them in week 4, somebody would have gone and looked in a box that was going in a lorry in week 9. And the one thing I had learned in 11 months of the first version is that asking for a document is how a document becomes findable and how it becomes disposable. I have apologized to Gray Ferrier since. He said, and I am quoting him, that if I had told him in the February, he would have written it in his notebook and put in a request through the proper channel, and it would have been actioned in about 6 weeks. And then he looked at the table for a bit and said, well, On the Sunday, the 23rd of March, I let myself into the portable building with my own key at 7 in the morning and photographed 411 pages on a phone, on the floor, one at a time, and it took 9 hours and 40 minutes, and I did not eat. I did the 2019 handover first, then the Splice log, then the rope contractor's annual certifications for 6 years, then the 2018 magnetic test, and then, because I had time, and because I had learned in the first version that you never know what you will want, the entire correspondence file between the center and the contractor from 2019, which is 206 pages of nothing, and which turned out 11 months later to contain the only email in this whole story that matters. It is from Struan Machar to the contractor's account manager, dated the 11th of April 2019, and it is 1 line long, and it says, "Take the rope testing out of the annual, and we will do it as a separate order when we can afford it. Take it out, not forgot, not overlooked. Took it out deliberately for money in April 2019, intending to reinstate it, and then did not. For 6 years, the way you do not do a thing that is not on a schedule anywhere. And in the first version of my life, that email went into a confidential waste lorry on the 28th of March, and I sat in a courtroom in Inverness in the November listening to a man give evidence about a young lad's training, and I did not know it had ever existed." Thank you for listening to Channel Crystal Novel. A concluded inquiry can be reopened. That is the mechanism, and almost nobody knows it, including me, in the first version, until it was far too late to matter. A sheriff's determination is not a final judgment in the way a conviction is. The Lord Advocate can apply for a fresh inquiry where there is new evidence which was not available and could not reasonably have been made available at the original inquiry. And it is rare, and it happens, and the test is not whether somebody is at fault. It is whether the evidence is new and material. So the whole of my second life, from the 23rd of March onward, was aimed at exactly one thing, which is not the truth, and not justice, and not Struan Machar. It was aimed at satisfying a two-limb legal test, new, and not reasonably available. And that is the reason I did not go to a newspaper and did not go to the family and did not stand up at the original inquiry in the June and start shouting, all of which I wanted to do about once a fortnight for 11 months. Because if I had produced those photographs at the first inquiry, they would have been available at the first inquiry, and the finding about Rab would have been made anyway, or not, and either way there would have been no second bite. I had to let the first inquiry run. I sat through it again. I gave evidence again in the June, and I gave the same evidence I had given the first time, which is the worst thing I have ever done and which I would do again, because the alternative was a fatal accident inquiry that heard half a story and could never be made to hear the other half. And in the November, the determination came out again, word for word, the same 11 pages about a 24-year-old, and I read it in the same waiting room, and then I went home and started the letter that took 4 months to the Crown Office, with 411 photographs and a schedule of what each one was and where it had been on the 27th of March and where it was on the 29th. Struan Machar came to see me in the September between the two inquiries, and it is the only time in either life that he and I have spoken about any of it, and it was 9 minutes long, and he never once said anything that could be written down. He said the Crown Office had been in touch with the center. He said he understood that documents had come from somewhere, and that he was not asking where. And then he sat on the bench in my workshop, a man of 59, who has run that hill since 2016, and who has, and I will say this for him until I die, personally dug out a stalled chair in a whiteout at 2 in the morning more than once, and he said, "Marta, do you think I'd have taken it out of the scope if I'd known what a splice does?" And the honest answer is no, I do not think he knew what a splice does. He is not an engineer and never claimed to be, and the 2019 scope was written by a man with a spreadsheet and a savings target of 11%, and he took out a line he did not understand, and 6 people died 6 years later. And no jury on earth would send him to prison for it, and I am not sure I would either. What I said to him was the only thing I had. I said, "You didn't know in 2019. What did you know on the 28th of March?" And he looked at the floor for about 4 seconds, and then he said, "I want you to know I never once thought about that boy," which is either the most damning sentence anybody said in 2 years or the most human one, and I have gone back and forth on it for 2 years, and I am no further on. Rab Innes came to the center in the May of the first year, before any of it, when we were still shut, and I have not been able to leave this out, although I have tried. She came to collect his things. There is a locker and a jacket and a pair of boots and a flask, and Fiona had put it all in a box except the flask, which nobody would touch, and Rab Innes stood in the crew room and looked at the shelf above the console through the window and said, "Leave that where it is." And then she said to me, because I was the one standing there, "You were his boss. Was he any good?" And I said he was the best young lad I have had in 18 years, which is true. And she said, "They're saying he pressed the wrong thing." And I had, at that moment, in my head, the whole of a determination that would not be published for another 7 months, and 411 photographs in a drawer at home, and a legal test about new evidence that I could not explain to a woman in a crew room without destroying the only root I had. So I said, "They're saying that because they haven't got the whole file yet." And she said, "Will they get it?" And I said, "Yes." That is the only promise I have ever made to anybody about anything I could not control, and it took 2 years and 4 months, and there were about 9 occasions in the middle of it when I thought I was going to have to go back to that woman and tell her I had been wrong to say it. They came at me in the January, once the Crown Office wrote to the Center for Comment, and it was Fiona Balfour, and it was the kindest thing anybody did to me in 2 years, and it was very nearly the end of it. Fiona does HR, and has done since 2011, and she is genuinely good, and she came to the workshop with 2 coffees and sat on the bench and said, "They'll close us." She said the center employs 91 people directly and about 400 in the Glen in the season, and that the insurers were already impossible, and that a second inquiry means 2 more years of it, and no bank will lend into that, and that Ken had been to see the bank in the December. And then she said the aimed thing, and it was aimed beautifully because it was true. She said, "And Rab's mother has just about got to a place where she can go to the co-op without somebody saying his name to her, and you're going to put him back on the front of the paper for 2 years to change 1 paragraph. And I sat on a bench in my own workshop and could not answer her, because the paragraph is 1 paragraph, and 2 years is 2 years, and Rab Innes had been in the shop the previous week and had said hello to me like a person. What I said in the end, and it took me about a minute to get to it, was, "Fiona, that paragraph is what his brother is going to read when he applies for an apprenticeship in 4 years." And she did not have an answer to that, and she did not pretend to, and she picked up both coffees and took them away with her, which I have always thought was the most honest thing she could have done. The fresh determination came in the second spring, 2 years and 4 months after the carrier came off. The Crown Office applied in the June, the application was granted in the October on the papers, and the fresh inquiry sat for 9 days in the February. Struan Machar gave evidence for a day and a half, and the 11th of April 2019 email was put to him at about 11 in the morning of the second day, and he said he had no recollection of it. And he was then taken to his own reply to the account manager's acknowledgement, which is 3 words long, and says, "Yes, that's right." And after that he did not say very much. The determination is 31 pages. It finds that the hull rope splice had not been subject to magnetic rope testing for 7 years, that the omission originated in a deliberate removal from the annual certification scope in April 2019 for cost reasons, that the splice had suffered progressive deformation which altered the rope diameter over its length, and that the grip on Carrier 19 released under shock loading at a section of rope which was outside the diameter tolerance for that grip. And then it finds the thing I went back for. It finds that the emergency stop initiated from the drive station on the 22nd of January was a correct response to an observed rope oscillation and was in accordance with the attendant's training, and that no criticism of the actions of Mr. Innes is warranted. 22 words. That is what 2 years bought. The 9 days of the fresh inquiry were not what I expected either. I gave evidence on the 4th day, and the first thing that happened was that the Center's counsel took me through my own June statement from the first inquiry, line by line, and asked me whether it was true, and I had to say that paragraph 11 of it was wrong, not mistaken, wrong, and known to be incomplete when I signed it, because by the June I had 411 photographs in a drawer, and I gave a statement that did not mention them. He asked me why. And I said, because if I had produced them in the June, there would never have been a second inquiry, and the finding about Mr. Innes would have stood or fallen on one afternoon in front of a sheriff who had already heard 8 days of evidence about a boy's reset procedure. He said, so you deliberately withheld material from a fatal accident inquiry? And I said yes. The sheriff let that sit for a moment and then said one sentence which is in the transcript and which I have not been able to stop thinking about, which is that the witness's conduct is a matter for others, but the court notes that the material would not be before it today by any other route. I was not referred to anybody. I could have been. I spent 4 months expecting a letter, and it never came, and I do not know to this day whether that was mercy or arithmetic. Struan Machar was not prosecuted. The Crown considered it, and the decision was that a deliberate removal from a scope of works 6 years before a death, without more, does not carry a prosecution over the line in Scotland. And I have read the letter 4 times, and I understand the reasoning, and I do not accept it, and my acceptance is not required. He resigned in the March before the fresh inquiry, took a job in England, and is a compliance consultant, which I find so funny that it has stopped being funny. Ken Follis sold the center in the second summer to a consortium that kept it open and kept 81 of the 91 jobs, and Fiona was one of the 10, which is a thing I think about most days. The center's insurers settled the civil claims in the 3rd year without a trial, at figures nobody is permitted to describe, and the settlement letters went out in the same week as the fresh determination, which the family's solicitor told me was not a coincidence and was not generosity either. The HSE reopened its own file and served 2 improvement notices on the new owners about matters that had nothing to do with any of this, which is what always happens, and which the new owners were quite reasonably annoyed about. The Scottish government's response to the sheriff's recommendations took 14 months and accepted 4 of 5, and the one it did not accept was the one about mandatory independent verification of certification scopes, which is the only one that would have stopped it, and the reason given was proportionality. And the Trade Association put out a bulletin in the second autumn, 4 paragraphs, telling every operator in Britain to check whether splice testing appears separately in their certification scope, and I know of 11 centers that found it did not. And every one of those 11 is a place where this could have happened and now cannot, and that bulletin is the only monument any of them will ever get. The rope contractor lost its accreditation for 11 months and got it back. The standard was amended in the 3rd year so that magnetic rope testing of splices is called out separately from rope testing, in bold, on its own line, because it turns out that the entire disaster was a formatting problem in a schedule. And there is now a line of bold text in a European standard that exists because 6 people are dead and because a lad asked who checks. I still work on that hill. I did not expect to, and I did not particularly want to, and I could not think of a single other thing to do with myself. I am the responsible engineer for a gondola, a chairlift, and 2 tows, And the new owners kept me on, partly because they had to, and partly, I think, because a woman who has had a fatal accident inquiry reconvened is not a woman who is going to sign a certificate she has not read. I do the Splice inspection myself now. It is not my job. I stand at the drive station with the maintenance contractor while he does it, and I hold the light and I write the number down myself in a book that is mine, and he thinks I do not trust him, and he is wrong. I do trust him, and I do it anyway, and I will do it until I stop working. Marta Innes came to see me in the April after the fresh determination. She came to the workshop and stood in the door and said, "They've taken it off him." And I said they had, and she said, "How long did you know?" And there is a version of this where I say 2 years, and there is a version where I say since the November before it happened when he asked me a question I did not answer properly. And there is the true version, which is that I have known for 2 lifetimes, and one of those does not exist and cannot be described to a woman standing in a workshop door. What I said was, long enough that I should have been faster, and she looked at me for a while, and then she said, well, which in this part of the world can mean about 9 different things, and she left. His flask is still on the shelf above the console. It was still there when the new owners took over, and one of them asked, in the first week, whether anybody wanted it moved, and 4 people said no at the same time, and the man had the sense to leave it, and it is going to be on that shelf when I am dead. So here is what I want to know from you, since you have been standing on that platform with me the whole way. Did she go far enough, or was she still too merciful? Comment justice if the ending was perfect. Comment harder if you wanted an even colder revenge. Your comments decide how ruthless the next ending should be. Like and subscribe if you want to be here for the next